As you know, dialectical materialism is the most advanced worldview of modernity, irreconcilably hostile to every stagnation, all reaction. Dialectical materialism as a worldview of the Marxist-Leninist party is the direct opposite of bourgeois ideology. Marxist philosophy did not stand aside from the preceding development of human thought. However, Marx and Engels could not simply borrow and mechanically include in their worldview the advanced ideas of previous social thought, since these ideas were limited by the philosophical prejudices of their era, the framework of the bourgeois world outlook. It is known that Marx and Engels took the rational grain from the dialectic of Hegel, the main grain of Feuerbach's materialism. But this does not mean that all that Marx and Engels remained on the soil of German philosophy. Defining the attitude of Marxist dialectics to the dialectic of Hegel, Comrade Stalin wrote, characterizing their dialectical method, Marx and Engels usually refer to Hegel as a philosopher who formulated the basic features of dialectics. This, however, does not mean that the dialectic of Marx and Engels is identical with Hegel's dialectic. In fact, Marx and Engels took from the dialectic of Hegel only its rational grain, rejecting Hegel's idealistic husks and developing dialectics further, in order to give it a modern scientific form. The Marxist dialectical method is directly opposed to the method of Hegel. Marx and Engels could not adopt in the finished form the principles of German philosophy. In creating his scientific, revolutionary world outlook, Marx and Engels fought tirelessly and relentlessly against German ideology and German philosophy. The German ideology of that time was the main enemy of the scientific, Marxist worldview. This was Marx and Engels very clearly said to some of his work, The Holy Family. The most dangerous enemy of the real humanism in Germany is spiritualism or speculative idealism, which is the place of the actual individual man puts self, or spirit. And together with the evangelist teaches, the spirit is life-giving, the flesh is weak. It goes without saying that this disembodied spirit is gifted with the mind only in its imagination. What we struggle with in Bauer's criticism is precisely the speculative thinking that caricature reproduces itself. We see in it the most perfect expression of the Christian German principle, the last time manifesting itself in an attempt to turn the very criticism into a transcendent force. 1. Marx and Engels clearly saw that without the defeat of this German ideology, without the consistent exposure of German philosophy, it was impossible to substantiate and develop a scientific proletarian worldview. It was inconceivable that the scientific worldview should prevail in the labor movement. It is not surprising, therefore, that all the earlier works of Marx and Engels are directed against the German ideology and, in particular, against the prejudices of German philosophy, including Hegel and Feuerbach. In the years 1841–1842 Engels wrote 3 philosophical pamphlets, Schelling about Hegel, Schelling and Revelation, and Schelling, a Philosopher in Christ, or the Transformation of Worldly Wisdom into Divine Wisdom. In these pamphlets, Engels criticizes Schelling's reactionary philosophy and at the same time he already notes the limitations, moderation, and conservatism of the conclusions of Hegel's philosophy. In 1843–1844, Marx wrote 2 articles for the German-French Chronicles, to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of law and to the Jewish question. Both articles are wholly directed against the German ideology of that time, against Hegel's philosophy. Marx gave them the first drafts of his materialistic worldview and exposed the reactionary prejudices of Hegelianism. In the period 1844–1846, Marx and Engels prepared 2 major works, The Holy Family and German Ideology, dedicated to criticism of German ideology and, in particular, criticism of the then German philosophy. In these works, Marx and Engels show that one cannot justify and advance a new worldview without rejecting the reactionary prejudices of German philosophy. German ideology turned all real relations on the head. She saw the basis of all phenomena in the spiritual side, either in absolute spirit, whether in the subject, or in the self-consciousness. The followers of Hegel's philosophy, the young Hegelians, who portray themselves as revolutionaries and, moreover, almost the most extreme revolutionaries, or in fact extreme reactionaries. They spread illusions that the improvement of earthly relations depends solely on criticism of these relations. All the changes in social life were reduced, according to the young Hegelians, only to changes in the sphere of ideology. In the preface to the German Ideology, Marx and Engels said, "The first volume of the proposed work aims to expose these sheep who consider themselves wolves and are mistaken for such sheep, to show that they bleach only philosophically reproduce the ideas of the German bourgeois, that the boastful speeches of these philosophical interpreters only reflect the wretchedness of German reality." 2. German ideologists allegedly subjected to merciless criticism all that exists and therefore call themselves representatives of critical criticism. In reality, this critical criticism did not criticize anything, but only revolved around ideological issues. Marx and Engels abruptly and wittily, caustically and mercilessly chastise critical criticism. Criticism only does that it forms formulas from the categories of the existing, namely, from the existing Hegelian philosophy and existing social aspirations. Formulas, and nothing more than formulas. And despite all her attacks on dogmatism, she condemns herself to dogmatism, and, moreover, to dogmatism of women. She is and remains an old woman. She is a withered and dowager Hegelian philosophy that browns and tones up her body that has dried up to the hideous abstraction and glances at the whole of Germany in search of her fiancé. 3. In giving such a murderous description of German philosophy, the ideology of the young Hegelians, Marx and Engels proceeded from the premise that, without overcoming this ideology, it was inconceivable either to create a revolutionary party or equip it with an advanced scientific worldview. The German ideology was nothing more than a theoretical justification for the reality of the day, which is printed in bold letters here and below. It was the ideology of a cowardly, conservative German bourgeoisie who timidly thought about political power, but most of all feared the revolution. This ideology of crude Prussian nationalism and chauvinism was the obstacle that had to be broken in the way of creating a new, scientific worldview. Without regard to all this German ideology, one cannot understand Hegel's dialectic. The rational grain of Hegel's dialectic, his doctrine of development, is squeezed into the narrow, ugly framework of German ideology. The contradiction between the method of Hegel, his dialectic, and between his conservative idealistic system finds its explanation in the peculiarities of the then German situation, in the peculiarities of German ideology. Hegel's idealistic system as a whole was an excuse for the German reality of that time, the justification of the existing order and the proof of their perfection, eternity and immutability. It is clear from this that Hegel's method came into sharp contradiction with his idealistic system. Hegel's method taught about development, about change, and the whole meaning of the Hegelian system was reduced to the fact that the development had already come to an end and ceased. Development refers only to the past. In the past history, changes occurred, some forms were replaced by others, higher. But since the most perfect forms were embodied in German reality, further movement is suspended. Hence it can be seen that Hegel's dialectic is opposed to Marx's dialectic, that this contrast reflects the antithesis of bourgeois and proletarian worldviews. The philosophy of Hegel reflects the system of the bourgeois world outlook, namely the worldview of the German bourgeois, cowardly, conservative, chauvinistically minded. Fichte, Hegel and their writings are often enraptured by the French Revolution, but it would be profoundly mistaken on the basis of these phrases to consider Fichte and Hegel as supporters of this revolution. Both Fichte and Hegel, like other representatives of German ideology, admired the French Revolution only theoretically, and even admired In fact, not by the revolution itself, but by its ideas. On the ideology of the German philosophers of that time, the vile Prussian reality cast its stamp. Their ideology, alien to revolutionary practice, was extremely abstract. The German bourgeoisie was quite reconciled with the miserable and backward German reality. Hegel was the ideologist of the growing German bourgeoisie, whose development, however, was hampered by the presence of feudal order in the country. Germany was then an economically backward country in comparison with France and England. While the French bourgeoisie established its rule by revolutionary means, and the British bourgeoisie revolutionized industry and won a number of colonies, Germany remained fragmented into a number of feudal principalities, and the German bourgeoisie could only dream of what the bourgeoisie had achieved in France and in England. Weak in economic and political relations, the German bourgeoisie groveled before the small, powerful princes, reconciling with the feudal reaction that prevailed in the country. In Prussia, power was in the hands of the Junker landowners, who preached zoological nationalism, hatred of progressive social ideas, implanted a cult of medieval barbarism. Their worldview was reduced to the assertion that the whole world was created for the Germans, that the Germans had reached the highest stage of development. Note RP, these ideas have found their continuation in an extreme reaction, which subsequently manifested not the feudal aristocracy, but the bourgeoisie, in Germany's fascism. The German bourgeoisie and its ideologists, as Marx and Engels repeatedly pointed out, feared the revolution most of all, especially from the time when in France the revolution entered into a decisive battle with the counter-revolution. Even the idea of the possibility of a revolution in Germany was not tolerated by the German bourgeoisie. Describing her attitude towards the French Revolution, Engels wrote, "But suddenly the French Revolution, like a thunderbolt, struck this chaos, called Germany. All middle class and the best part of the nobility with joyful jubilation belonged to the National Assembly and to the French people. All German poets glorified the glory of the French people. But it was purely German enthusiasm, it had only a metaphysical character, it concerned only the theory of the French revolutionaries. But when the theories were pushed to the background by the facts, as soon as the people practically established their power thanks to the August 10th coup, when, in addition, the overthrow of the Girondists on May 31, 1793 silenced all theories, then this enthusiasm of Germany was replaced by a fanatical hatred of revolution. 4. The mentality of the German bourgeois could not but reflect on the views of Hegel. It was not for nothing that Hegel, who extolled theoretically the ideas of the French Revolution, furiously argued the impossibility and unnecessariness of the revolution in Germany. Precisely because the German bourgeoisie of that time and representatives of its ideology did not even think about moving forward, but only about affirming the existing reactionary reality, that is why Hegel's dialectic is turned exclusively to the past history. When Hegel examines the past, the history of philosophy, religion, aesthetics, the history of law, he shows progress there, progressive development, a change in the situation, and the replacement of obsolete forms with new, higher forms. But as soon as Hegel reaches his era, he changes dialectics and as an inveterate metaphysician insists that further development is impossible, improvements in reality have already been made. Hegel believed that the entire preceding history of society, the history of law, philosophy, religion, aesthetics, prepared the perfect state of affairs that had developed in Germany, and further development was unnecessary and impossible. Hegel believed that the revolution that occurred in France cannot be repeated in Germany, for in Germany the development process has already come to an end, everything has already reached its perfection. Rejecting the possibility of a revolution in Germany, Hegel wrote in his Philosophy of History, "The formal principle of philosophy in Germany is opposed to a concrete world and reality with an internally satisfied need for the spirit and with a consoled conscience. In Germany, enlightenment stood on the side of theology, In France it immediately adopted a direction hostile to the Church. In Germany, everything in secular affairs has already been improved thanks to the Reformation. 5. Hegel refused to look ahead, apply dialectics to the consideration of the future development of society, believing that in general theory cannot look to the future. Its purpose is to understand what is. One can understand that there are, that is the task of philosophy. For what is, there is mind. Philosophy is just the modern era, comprehended in thought. It is just as foolish to think that any philosophy can go beyond the limits of the modern world. How foolish it is to think that a single individual can jump over his epoch, if his theory really goes beyond it, if he builds his own world. How it must be, this world, although it is true, exists, however, only in its opinion. 6. Commentary RP 1 into one of our bourgeois ideologists, since perestroika convinced everyone that Marxism is just a private opinion of Marx and believing in his infallibility of his supporters that communism is an artificial scheme, a desirable reality, see Hegel, how it should be and no more than that there is nothing scientific in Marxism. It's clear. Now it is clear where this false thesis came from, who from the philosophers of the past historical epoch, ideologically impregnated our bourgeois counter-revolutionaries Hegel. In German ideology, the narrowest possibleness of the bourgeois worldview was most vividly, most clearly manifested, and Hegel's dialectic suffers precisely this bourgeois limitation. What is the connection between Hegel's dialectic and the bourgeois worldview? How did it happen that Hegel discovered dialectics and at the same time obscured it? To understand this question, it should be borne in mind that the ideas contained in the dialectical method of Hegel are not at all exclusive property of German philosophy, in particular Hegel. In one form or another, these ideas were characteristic of the whole of that era. Hegel only logically systematized, substantiated, developed in the philosophical system the ideas spread at that time. What is the essence of Hegel's dialectical method, if we take his rational grain? The fact that phenomena are not always the way they are, that phenomena are constantly changing, evolving, while their development is carried out through contradictions, through the struggle of opposing sides. Were there such ideas in the bourgeois worldview of that era? Yes, there were, and not only in German philosophy. In political economy, in historical science and in the literature of Europe of that time, the idea that the world is developing, that there are contradictions in it, was widely spread. This is understandable. The bourgeois epoch so exposed and simplified all social contradictions that they could no longer be ignored. Therefore, bourgeois economists, historians, philosophers observed and described the contradictory development of society. Bourgeois economists have discovered the economic basis for the existence of classes. For example, Ricardo wrote, "Product of the land, all that is obtained from its surface by the united application of labor, machinery, and capital, is divided among three classes of society, namely the landowners, money owners or capital and labor, which it is processed." 7.